For the first time in decades, China's population has declined by 850,000 people, according to official numbers. That doesn't sound like much for a country of more than 1 billion Chinese, but this moment marks a trend we'll be seeing over this century. Projections show that by 2100, China's population will be lower than it was even in the 1960s. This demographic shift will have massive consequences, not just for China, but globally. Here's a look back at how China has tried to manage its population up to now.
Booming megacities teeming with people. That's the image of 21st century China. And yet, China needs more babies. For the first time in 60 years, its population is shrinking. Despite dropping its notorious one-child policy some years ago, Chinese couples are reluctant to have more children.
We feel that the economic pressure on young people is quite high, especially for those from outside of Beijing who live here. It's already really difficult. For those of us that were born in the 80s, most of us are from one-child families. There's a lot of pressure when it comes to taking care of your parents and improving your quality of life in the future.
This is an inevitable outcome. At the moment, people born in the 2000s are just reaching their 20s. And right now, many young people don't want to have kids. That's because of their economic circumstances and the social environment. So that's contributed to a decline in population growth.
Wind back to the 1950s, and China's population was exploding, fueled by Chairman Mao's belief that a large population was a key component of China's strength. But this led to poverty and food shortages, especially in rural areas. In 1979, authorities introduced a strict one-child policy, with families who violated it facing hefty fines and other penalties. But worries over a decline in the working-age population that could threaten China's position as the world's manufacturing powerhouse prompted a change. In 2016, the rules were relaxed to permit parents to have 2 children. 2 years ago, the policy was expanded to allow couples to have up to 3 children. But decades of social conditioning from the one-child policy, as well as economic worries, mean that Chinese couples remain unconvinced.
We don't think about it too much. We only care about whether having a second child is good for our family. I don't feel I should have more children because the birth rate of this country is falling. We don't think that way. I'm happy as long as our family is happy with having only one child.
China is still the most populous country in the world, but if it can't reverse its slowing rate of population growth, it's set to face a demographic time bomb.
Well, joining us in the studio is journalist Fabian Kretschmer, usually based in Beijing. Fabian, welcome. Why is this moment a big deal for China? Why is this moment scary?
Well, in my opinion, it's really a big deal on many levels, and the most important aspect is probably the economic dimension. I think this is really the biggest threat to China's economic rise, bigger than, for example, the trade war with the US, bigger than the ongoing real estate crisis. Why? Because the consequences are really long-lasting. Declining population means shrinking workforce, so the population becomes less productive and the growth rates will stagnate. So the times of fast growth is over. That, of course, has huge consequences, and those can be felt also globally. For example, China is producing a lot of goods, but if they cannot maintain their manufacturing industry because of the shrinking workforce, then they produce less goods. That means higher prices, and will probably also have an impact on the inflation here in Europe.
Now, this is big news all over the world today, and there's a lot of buzz in China about this moment. There's a lot of angst. That's what I sense. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, understandably so. Many Chinese grew up, with the knowledge that it will get better, like, circumstances will improve, wages will get higher, and the economy is increasing. And in the last decades, except during the pandemic, the economic rise was really very fast. But now this will be over. So, of course, the angst is that we will not, sustain this rise. And, of course, there's a short time window. China has to get rich before it gets old. That's what the experts experts say, because the demographic change will happen. The question is how fast it will happen. And now China, its GDP per capita is not as high as it should be before it, gets old and will have a stagnation in terms of economic rise.
And of course, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but one way, of course, to fight demographic decline is to have a welcoming immigration policy that doesn't, I'm guessing that's not the case with China.
No, I don't see that, and there's no political will for that. Why? I mean, this government is really obsessed about social stability. It's obsessed about ideological control. If you have a lot of migration, that means also a lot of cultural exchange, also exchange with different and alternative ideas. I don't think that's what the government right now wants. They rather see this as a risk, and what it bets on is more like technological solutions. They want to improve automation, artificial intelligence to compensate with the shrinking workforce. But if this can work out, I mean, I'm really skeptical.
Very interesting. So absent that, I mean, the government has to do its best to convince people to have babies. And on that note, I would definitely want to share this with people back home. We have some video of a Communist Party event. This is a dating event for party members. They're playing hoops there, trying to have the government be matchmaker, to have couples and to have families. One thing I'm wondering about all this, Fabian, is that, you have a generation of people told that they can only have one child. It's a bit like whiplash. Now suddenly you have the government trying to tell people to have as many children as possible. I mean, Is that convincing? I mean, it doesn't seem like people are cooperating.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, many young people feel that, it's ridiculous. I mean, the government acts as if, population control is something that you can steer like a wheel. You can just order people to have one child. Now you order them to have 3 children. But what the real problems are for many people, for many young families, is that, they cannot pay the bills. The living costs are so high. So some cannot afford to have more than one child. And also many, especially young women, for them, not having children is also a political subversive statement, because they basically don't, cooperate with the patriotic mandate that the government is propagating, because the government says you should have as many children as possible as a patriotic duty.
Well, that's fascinating. So even in an authoritarian state like China, it's hard to get people to do everything that you necessarily want. Now, in terms of this particular set of numbers from last year, the dip has something to do with COVID, right? I mean, imagine that a lot of people are sitting at home, couples are deciding, should we have children? And they're looking at the situation with access to hospitals. I mean, you've been in China all this time. Tell us about that angle of it.
Yeah, I would say this is even more general. The feeling that we had during those zero COVID times, especially in the last year with the frequent lockdowns, was basically you cannot predict anything in your everyday life. Tomorrow you could be locked in your apartment. You cannot plan anything. And also the economic damage was, getting out of control. All those factors played in that, times are very uncertain, and that is not really very good for when you want to plan to have babies. I mean, so I think many people really thought about their life plans and adjusted them, and probably, live a more alternative way also.
Now, of course, the other issue with this demographic decline is the issue of the elderly. This is a challenge that's faced by Japan and other developed countries, which is a growing aging population. I was in Beijing once, and I remember reporting on and visiting a nursing home. Those were the early days of these kinds of facilities. Those were not common in China at that time. Over the past decade, we've seen more and more of these facilities, and you have a situation where it's a country where there's one child with a burden of 4 grandparents. I want to share some of the comments from people in China, including the elderly, but others, about the stress that is creating.
Am I worried about getting old? Well, what can I do? I don't have much money. The country gives me 800 yuan a month, and it's enough for buying food. But it's not going to be enough if I get seriously ill in the future. No one knows what illness they'll get, right?
The government should relieve the burden on young parents' shoulders. It's too much for couples to look after their children and the elderly.
Because of the heavy social burden, the sons and daughters of the elderly have to find work elsewhere. Many elderly people are living alone. Some live with a husband or wife, but still, some live without relatives. They look for the warmth from a bowl of rice, but also want to feel cared for.
So, Fabian, you two have reported on this issue in China. We've kind of come full circle to the start of our talk, which is this is related to the economy, this financial burden, right, that the country has. Over the years that you've been in China, has the government indicated that they have a good solution to this elderly crisis? They have to take care of all these Chinese.
Well, to be fair, it's a really very complex issue and a very difficult issue. The elderly care is very basic and definitely not sufficient. This cannot be solved overnight, but I mean, there are only really slow progress. And in terms of how rapid the society is aging, I don't think it's enough. And, you know, there's a running joke, for example, which says if you want to get rich in China right now, invest in a retirement home or open up a elderly care, because that's really a booming business. The demand is very, very strong. But, yeah, there's really not enough care for the elderly. That will become a really big problem also in general for the health system.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, of course, this is a society that boasts that it is Confucian. It takes care of its elderly, and it's facing the same crisis that many other countries are facing. Fabian, it's so good to have you in the studio. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that we'll see you again.
No, thank you.